You don't lose judgment when you gain authority. You lose the feedback that made your judgment accurate, and the dangerous part is, it doesn't feel like a loss, it feels like progress at first. Everything gets easier, fewer people interrupt you, fewer people question you, decisions move faster, conversations feel smoother. There's less tension in the room, less friction in conversations, less resistance to your ideas. You start thinking, finally, I've figured this out, and maybe you have, maybe you've improved, maybe you've earned that position, but something else is happening underneath that no one points out. The friction is disappearing, and friction was never the problem. It was the thing keeping you aligned with reality. Most people misunderstand how good decision-making actually forms. They think it comes from intelligence, from experience, from confidence. But that's not where accuracy comes from. Accuracy comes from feedback loops, from resistance, from having your thinking interrupted, corrected, reshaped. Think about how your judgment was built. It didn't come from being right all the time. It came from being wrong and being shown you were wrong, from moments where your idea didn't hold up, from conversations where someone said, "That doesn't make sense." Those moments didn't feel good, but they did something important. They adjusted you. Every disagreement refined your thinking. Every correction sharpened your perspective. Every challenge forced you to see something you would have missed. Alone, that tension wasn't slowing you down, it was calibrating you. Now, imagine removing that. Not instantly, gradually. People hesitate before disagreeing. They soften their opinions. They avoid direct confrontation. They choose comfort over honesty, and eventually, they stop pushing back entirely. And here's where it becomes dangerous. You don't notice the absence of feedback. You interpret it as validation. You think, I must be getting better or worse. You stop questioning it entirely. I must be right more often. People finally understand, but that's not what's happening. You're not getting better. You getting less corrected. Let's make this real. Think about the last time you gave an idea, and no one pushed back. No hesitation, no questions, no resistance, just silence or agreement. In that moment, it feels clean, efficient, like everything is finally working. But go one step further. Would that same idea have survived when you had less authority? When people felt comfortable saying, "That's not right," if the answer is no, then the idea didn't get better. The environment got quieter, and once correction disappears, something subtle replaces itself. Confirmation. You generate an idea, you evaluate it, you approve it, all inside your own perspective. No interruption, no resistance, just a system that never gets challenged. Just you agreeing with yourself. It's a system that feels intelligent because it never gets corrected. And this is where decision-making begins to shift, not visibly, internally. Because without feedback, your thinking becomes a closed system, and closed systems don't self-correct. This is why power and decision-making start to separate over time. You see it in leaders who stop adapting, not because they got worse, but because the system around them stopped correcting them. History is filled with this pattern. Leaders surrounded by agreement, making decisions that slowly detach from reality. Companies that looked stable right before they collapsed. Blockbuster had internal reports warning about streaming. The signals existed, the people existed, but by that point, no one who disagreed could get through. Not because the information wasn't there, because the identity around the decision had already formed. Not because no one saw the problem, but because no one could say it in a way that would land. Decisions that looked confident, but ignored obvious signals, warnings that were visible, but never acknowledged. And once feedback can't land, it might as well not exist, and without it, your thinking doesn't adjust, it stabilizes even when it's wrong. This is where overconfidence starts to form, not from ego, from silence. Because confidence doesn't come from truth, it comes from the absence of contradiction. The less pushback you receive, the more stable your thinking feels, and stability feels like clarity, but it's not clarity. It's just unchallenged. You've seen this happen. A leader who used to listen starts dismissing ideas. A creator who once understood their audience starts missing what matters. Someone who used to question themselves becomes rigid without realizing it from the outside. It's obvious. You can see the gap forming. You can feel something is off, and you think, how do they not see this? They don't see it. Because the signals that would show it to them are gone. Feedback doesn't just inform you, interrupts you. It breaks your internal narrative long enough for reality to get in without that interruption. Your mind starts repeating itself, and repeated thinking feels like clarity. But it's not clarity, it's reinforcement, and reinforcement feels good, feels smooth, predictable, controlled. There's no friction, no discomfort, no doubt, but doubt wasn't the problem. It was the signal, it was the part of your thinking that said, "House, look again, check this." And when that signal fades, you don't feel lost, you feel certain. That's why power and decision-making don't always move together, because power reduces resistance. Resistance was keeping your decisions accurate, so the real question isn't, are you making good decisions? That question is too easy, too comfortable. The better question is, what is still correcting you? Where does your thinking meet resistance? Who is still willing to disagree with you? Honestly, what in your life can interrupt your certainty? Because if nothing can, then your thinking isn't being tested, it's being repeated, and repeated thinking creates something dangerous. That confusion, certainty, and certainty without feedback is where people start drifting. Not suddenly, not dramatically, quietly, gradually. A decision slightly off, a judgment slightly biased, an assumption slightly unchecked, and because nothing corrects it, it stays, and then it builds. This is how people become confident and wrong at the same time. Not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack effort, but because the system that used to correct them is no longer active. And here's where it goes deeper. Because the absence of feedback doesn't just affect your decisions, it reshapes your identity. And here's the part most people don't catch: you don't just lose feedback, you lose the ability to recognize it. At first, disagreement feels useful, then it feels inefficient, then it feels wrongy. Eventually, it feels like noise, and once that shift happens, you're no longer filtering for truth. You're filtering for comfort, and comfort is the one thing that will never correct you. You start seeing yourself differently, as someone who doesn't need correction, as someone who already understands, as someone who has moved beyond being questioned. And once that identity forms, you stop looking for anything that might challenge it. You stop exposing your thinking to resistance. Not intentionally, naturally, you gravitate toward agreement. You avoid friction. You interpret silence as proof, and over time, feedback doesn't just disappear around you, it stops being processed within you. Even when someone challenges you, it feels like noise, like disruption, like something unnecessary. So, instead of engaging with it, you dismiss it faster each time, and once that happens, your thinking loses its ability to update. At that point, it doesn't matter how intelligent you are. It doesn't matter how experienced you are. It doesn't matter how successful you've been. If your thinking can't update, it becomes outdated, even if it still feels sharp. This is why people plateau, not because they stopped trying, but because they stopped being corrected. And the hardest part? There's no clear moment where this begins, no warning signal, no obvious shift. It feels like progress the entire time. That's what makes it convincing. So, if things feel smoother than they used to, if fewer people challenge you, if your decisions feel more obvious, don't assume you've improved. Ask something harder. What stopped pushing back on you? Because whatever that was, it wasn't slowing you down, it was keeping you aligned. And if you want to stay aligned, if you want your decision-making to stay accurate, if you want your thinking to keep evolving, you have to do something most people avoid. You have to reintroduce friction. On purpose, you have to rebuild feedback loops, invite disagreement, expose your thinking to resistance. Let your ideas be challenged. Again, not because it feels good, but because it keeps you honest. Because accuracy doesn't come from control, it comes from correction. And the moment correction disappears, accuracy doesn't stay where it was. It begins to drift quietly, gradually, until one day you're not seeing more clearly. You're just seeing alone.